have an active shooter.
Let's go ahead and declare this a mass casualty.
Welcome to Active Shooter, a podcast that covers the whys, the hows, and the aftermath of active shooter and mass casualty events.
They have an active shooter in the building. A second call says they are being attacked.
I've been shot. 16910 means we got shots fired at 4:15 at Route 291. Sounded like an automatic firearm.
Active shooter, reports of an active shooter
mass casualty incidents.
Thank you for listening.
You are listening to Active Shooter, a podcast that may contain adult themes, explicit language, and graphic depictions of violence. Portions of this show may be traumatic for those under 18. Listener discretion is advised.
Breaking news, it's a tough day. 7 people confirmed dead after shootings in Half Moon Bay. A suspect in custody, as we've been reporting. We are expecting an update from the Sheriff's Department in moments. There is a heavy police presence right now at 2 different mushroom farms. Our crew was there as a man was taken into custody. You see there who is believed to be the suspect. And we are told he reportedly drove himself to the sheriff's substation.
This episode was written by a special guest writer, so the format and flow may differ from our usual storytelling style. We want to send out a special thank you to them for assisting us while our writer was spending time with her family during a difficult time. The Active team would like to thank you, our listeners, for your patience, understanding, and loyalty these past 4 years. We are now back on our bi-monthly schedule. Now, on with the show. Workplace shootings are tragic and terrifying events that continue to haunt the modern workforce. These incidents shake the foundations of trust and security that employees rely on in their daily lives. In this episode, we will delve into the complex web of factors that lead to workplace shootings, exploring motives, prevention strategies, and how to spot the warning signs. The first step in stopping workplace violence is understanding the motivations. Workplace shootings are often the culmination of multiple factors, and the motivations behind them are diverse. Some of the key motivations included disgruntlement, personal crisis, ideological beliefs, and workplace stress. For the disgruntled shooter, a common trigger is workplace exploitation. Employees who feel wronged, mistreated, or overlooked may resort to violence as a way to settle a score. Ideological belief shooters are often facing a personal crisis, such as financial difficulties, marital problems, or mental health issues. For these types of shooters, they may see their workplace as a convenient outlet for their anger and frustration. For the work-related stress shooter, employees often face heavy workloads, long hours, unrealistic expectations, and a lack of control over their tasks. Over time, this pressure can lead to the frustration, anxiety, and in extreme cases can turn into violent outbursts. Today's shooter was an immigrant California farm worker from China. We're going to get into that in a minute, but this shooter, whom we will call CZ, was both a disgruntled shooter seeking revenge, and a work-related stress shooter. Revenge is a powerful motivator for disgruntled workers. They may feel that violence is the only way to make their coworkers or superiors understand the pain they have endured. The desire for retaliation can manifest as a desire to harm others and cause suffering. They often have a specific list of individuals they want to target. It's this disgruntled revenge-type shooter who will often resort to violence to regain a sense of power and control that they believe they have lost. They may perceive violence as a way to establish dominance over those they believe have wronged them. On Monday, January 23rd, 2023, CZ, who was a 66-year-old Chinese immigrant farm worker, was on a deadly mission of revenge. His target was 2 mushroom farms located in Half Moon Bay, an affluent area with a mixture of farms, suburbs, and beach homes about 45 minutes from San Francisco. While this shooting was classified as workplace violence, that doesn't tell the whole story. In fact, this was both workplace violence and a spree killing that spanned over 2 properties. The first farm targeted was Mountain Mushroom Farm, which was also known as California Terra Garden. The second shooting scene was Concord Farms. At the time of the shooting, CZ was an immigrant farm worker who had entered California from his home in China on a work visa. It's often these types of workers who are exploited and preyed upon by unscrupulous agricultural employers. One of the most egregious forms of exploitation is the payment of sub-minimum wages. Some unscrupulous farm owners pay their workers well below the state's minimum wage, often in violation of state law and off the books, making it difficult for employees to track their earnings or seek legal remedies. Another issue is substandard housing, which is often faced by many immigrant farm workers. Some employers provide inadequate and overcrowded living conditions, such as making them live in cargo containers or other substandard accommodations. These living conditions can be unsanitary, unsafe, and lacking in basic amenities. Workers often have little choice but to accept these conditions because of their limited options and financial constraints. The language barrier can make these even more difficult to overcome. On that cold January afternoon, CZ was wearing a baseball hat, a red shirt with a black fleece vest, and dark blue jeans as he arrived at California Terra Garden in his maroon-colored SUV. He was brandishing a Ruger semi-automatic pistol when he approached the farm that grew mushrooms, basil, and other herbs. At 2:22 p.m., several 911 calls were placed to dispatch reporting a mass shooting. When first responders arrived, they discovered 4 deceased victims with fatal gunshot wounds. A 5th victim, who survived, was airlifted by helicopter to Stanford University Medical Center near Palo Alto with life-threatening injuries. As police and emergency crews were arriving at the scene, the gunman fled in his SUV and drove to Concord Farms, 2 miles away. The shooter had previously worked for Concord. Concord Farms was family-owned and operated for almost 40 years. According to its website, Concord is, quote, one of the largest growers and importers of gourmet mushrooms, supporting the growing popularity of mushrooms and various specialty vegetables in restaurants and on dinner tables across the country. Once CZ arrived at Concord, he knew the police would be looking for him and tried to quickly and efficiently kill those on his targeted list. At Concord, he killed 3 more victims who were all deceased by the time police and first responders arrived.
A guy come inside to the green's house, and he said, "Oh, you almost ready done?" Then we are saying, "Yes, we are almost ready." And then he go in, and then go outside again. Then when he came again, he shoot us person in the head. And then those guys come to the ground, he do again in the head.
As police realized they had a spree shooter on their hands, CZ drove himself to the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office substation at approximately 4:40 in the afternoon. He was immediately taken into custody without incident, and his weapon was found inside of his car. An onlooker described his demeanor as quiet, calm, and resigned to his fate. His cell phone was later found on the side of the highway, which seems to indicate he had briefly contemplated fleeing before deciding to turn himself in to authorities. Reports from survivors stated that CZ was very intentional with who he shot. Some of the victims were his coworkers or supervisors. There were several children present at the shooting scene, but all were left unharmed. It appeared that his first two victims were his former supervisors. Once they were dead, he went looking for specific coworkers with whom he had issues with in the past. One witness at Concord Farm said he had been working with one of the victims in a greenhouse when CZ entered. As he entered, one of the victims looked at the witness and said that CZ used to work here. The shooter took 3 steps towards the victim and shot him point blank until he was sure his intended target was dead. The terrified witness stated that the shooter looked directly at him and quoted, "He just made that gesture to me, as in, don't worry," with his hands. As CZ left the greenhouse, the witness ran outside and hid for what felt like 15 to 20 minutes. After he saw the shooter drive away, he ran to each of the 3 victims to try and render aid, but it was too late. Each one of them were dead. Once CZ was arrested, he cooperated immediately, and using a Mandarin translator began confessing. He told officers that when he first arrived at the police substation, he walked in and didn't see anyone in the front lobby, so he returned to his SUV for 2 hours and waited until an officer spotted him. He had been both a resident and employee of the first shooting location, California Terra Garden Farm. He spoke at length with investigators without an attorney present. He declined an attorney when he was read his rights. CZ was born on December 30th, 1956 in China. He had been living in the United States for the past 11 years and had obtained a green card. He has a 40-year-old daughter who still lives in China, and he would send money back to her each month. He lived and worked on the farm with his wife, who was also from China and didn't speak English. Investigators discovered that he had legally purchased his handgun in 2021, and there were no red flags associated with his gun purchase. He told investigators he complied with the waiting period and had no issues whatsoever obtaining his firearm. He had worked at California Terra Garden for 6 years as a forklift driver. It appears the cause of his workplace violence was a series of little slights that had built up over time. The most recent issue was a dispute over a repair bill for a piece of machinery. The repair was going to cost $100, and his supervisor insisted that the cost of the repair would need to come out of his paycheck. He was livid over this, as he didn't think the cost of repairs or the cause of the breakdown were his responsibility. It was this repair bill that was his final straw. He told investigators that the forklift became damaged in a crash with a bulldozer. He tried to explain to his boss that the crash wasn't his fault, and he wasn't going to pay for it. His boss got angry back and told him if he didn't pay for the repair, he would be fired. CZ told investigators that his treatment had caused him to suffer some kind of a mental illness, and he wasn't in his right mind at the time of the shooting. He also explained that he and his wife and other farm workers were forced to live in deplorable conditions. He alleged that he was living and sleeping in a shipping container and working for just $9 per hour. At the time, California's minimum wage was $15.50 per hour. He worked full-time, often overtime, but was offered no health care or any other kinds of support against Californian labor laws. Investigators learned that in 2013, the shooter was previously accused of trying to kill his roommate because the roommate didn't have any checks to pay him for a job he had done for the roommate. The roommate alleged that CZ had snuck into his sleeping quarters and tried to suffocate him with a pillow. The roommate had to fight him off to get him to remove the pillow from his face. After the incident, the former roommate filed a restraining order against the shooter. It appears that both the roommate and the shooter had worked at a restaurant job where the shooter had been fired. Several days after attempting to suffocate his roommate with a pillow, he threatened to kill him with a knife if he didn't help him get his restaurant job back. CZ told the roommate that next time he would use a kitchen knife to split his head open when he was sleeping, so he wouldn't be able to fight back. The roommate told investigators that CZ would often become frustrated with the language barrier at the former workplace. Most workers spoke Spanish and could communicate, which left him feeling left out since he only spoke Mandarin. Now let's discuss the victims. Ye Tao Bin was just 43 years old. Born on April 2, 1979, Bin came from China, where he was married to Xiaoji Meng. He immigrated from China to the U.S. in 2016. He first worked in New Jersey as a technician at a mushroom farm, but he later moved to California in 2022 to work at Terra Garden. He was planning a trip back to China in February, which would be the very first time he had been with his family since before the pandemic. He had a 4-year-old daughter and a son who had just been accepted into a university. He was an only son to his parents, but had 2 older sisters who all resided in China. He was the sole financial support for his parents, and especially his father, who had been diagnosed with cancer 2 years prior to the shooting. He was described by coworkers as a hard worker who loved his job. He was the first person at the farm each morning, and usually the last one to leave every day. The next 2 victims are Guizhong Chang, 66 years old, and Zhaizhen Liu, 73 years old. There isn't much information available on both of them. The next victim was Jingxi Liu, who was 64 years old and married. The employee who died in the greenhouse at Concord Farms was Marciano Martinez Jimenez. He was 50 years old at the time of his death and had lived in Half Moon Bay for 25 years working in the agricultural industry. He was a proud member of the Oaxacan community and considered a beloved father figure to many. He volunteered for the Rotacare Clinic in Half Moon Bay for many years to help his community. Rotacare is a clinic that provides free medical care to those in need in the agricultural community, knowing that many are undocumented and without medical insurance. A GoFundMe was set up for Marciano to raise funds to send his remains to his hometown of Oaxaca, Mexico, for a traditional burial. He was described as an honorable and hard-working man among his friends and coworkers. According to the GoFundMe, he was a son, brother, uncle, and dear friend to many. He loved to dance, and his favorite was a traditional Oaxacan dance called the Danza de la Pluma. He was also a musician and talented accordion player. The next victim was Jose Romero Perez, who had just moved to Half Bay 18 months earlier. His younger brother, Pedro Romero Perez, was just 23 years old and had also been shot, but survived. Jose left behind his parents, wife, and 4 children in Oaxaca, Mexico. He had come to Half Moon Bay in search of work to send back to support his family. A GoFundMe was also set up in his name to help defray the cost of sending his body home to Mexico. The next victim was Ai Zhang Zhang, who was 74 years old. He was married to Jingxi Liu and worked at the farm in the cafeteria. The shooter was arraigned in San Mateo County Superior Court in Redwood City on 7 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder, plus enhancements for firearm use. This case included special circumstances since it involved multiple murders, which makes it eligible for capital murder, although there is currently a moratorium on all death row sentences. Regardless, the shooter is still eligible to be sentenced to death or life without parole. The shooter was appointed 2 attorneys, who were both death penalty cases qualified. Because of the nature of his case, he was held without bond. He was back in court a few weeks later on February 16, 2023. This time, he wore an orange jail jumpsuit and kept his head bowed while he pleaded not guilty. He showed no emotion and spoke through his court-appointed Mandarin translator. Through his attorneys, he waived his right to a preliminary hearing, and once again the judge denied his request for a bond. He currently has a preliminary hearing scheduled for December 4th, 2023, which is expected to last for 5 days. An investigation into the labor and workforce practices at both locations where the shootings took place were later opened. In a press briefing, the White House press secretary Karine Jean-Pierre expressed that the White House had directed federal law enforcement to help local authorities during their investigation. The governor of California was informed of the shootings while he was visiting victims of another shooting just 48 hours earlier in Monterey Park. He described the two events as tragedy upon tragedy. The living conditions of the workers at the California Terra Garden drew attention following reports that many of the employees lived in shipping or storage containers, and the site did not follow all permit and code requirements. It was discovered that many of the workers were being paid below California's minimum wage requirements. The company later said it would improve the housing for workers and families and pay all minimum wage requirements going forward. California Terra Garden was charged with 22 violations in order to pay $113,800 in fines. One of the violations was that they failed to, quote, immediately notify employees of an active shooter threat and instruct them to seek shelter. The other violations included failure to investigate an employee's back injury and failing to provide sanitary hand-washing stations at the toilet facilities. There were several other violations in the report, which can be found online. The Concord farm was cited with 19 workplace violations in order to pay $51,770 in fines. Their violations included failure to address previous incidents of workplace violence and develop procedures to correct and prevent this hazard again. They were also cited for insects and rodents found in the workplace, water leakage in farm worker housing, and failing to have proper precautions around heat exhaustion for employees. The employees were found to be living in terrible work conditions, which included shacks and trailers with inadequate heating or plumbing. Many of them had no running water or electricity. The plight of the immigrant Chinese and Hispanic farm workers in California is often marked by harsh and exploitative conditions, as they face numerous challenges due to their limited language skills, lack of resources, and vulnerability to exploitation by employers. These workers are typically drawn to the California agriculture industry in search of employment opportunities, seeking to provide a better life for themselves and their families, but they often find themselves in difficult circumstances. The state of California recognizes the challenges faced by immigrant farm workers and has taken several steps to help protect their rights and well-being moving forward. The state has implemented labor laws and regulations designed to ensure fair wages, safe working conditions, and access to basic amenities for all agricultural workers, regardless of their immigration status. California's labor agencies and organizations also provide resources to help educate immigrant workers about their rights and provide avenues for reporting abuse and exploitation. Hopefully, these changes will reduce the instances of workplace violence. Community organizations and non-governmental entities, such as labor unions and worker advocacy groups, also play a crucial role in supporting immigrant farm workers. They provide legal assistance, education, and advocacy, helping workers understand their rights and seek justice when they are mistreated. In recent years, California has increased its efforts to combat the exploitation of immigrant farm workers through enhanced labor inspections, outreach programs, and legal protections. This includes measures to address wage theft, unsafe working conditions, and inadequate housing for agricultural workers. California, like many other states, has taken various measures to address and reduce workplace violence and prevent mass shootings. Some of the key actions and initiatives are aimed at achieving this goal by implementing the workplace violence prevention programs through California's Division of Occupational Safety and Health Services, also known as Cal-OSHA. OSHA has established regulations that require employers to develop and implement workplace violence prevention programs. These programs are particularly important in industries where the risk of violence is elevated, such as agriculture, healthcare, and social services. Employers are encouraged to assess the potential for violence, develop procedures for responding to threats or acts of violence, and provide training to employees on how to respond during a mass shooter event. Many employers in California offer active shooter training to their employees, which includes education, lockdown procedures, evacuation plans, and how to communicate with law enforcement. California also encourages employees to report concerns about workplace violence to their employers, and laws protect whistleblowers who report unsafe working conditions. Reporting mechanisms are crucial for identifying potential threats and addressing them before they escalate. California has also invested in mental health services programs to provide support to individuals who may be at risk of engaging in violent behavior. Access to mental health resources can help identify and assist individuals in crisis before they resort to violence. While these measures have been put in place to reduce workplace violence and prevent mass shootings, it's important to note that workplace safety is an ongoing challenge. Employers, employees, law enforcement, and government agencies continue to collaborate and adapt their strategies to address this issue and create safer work environments in the state. We all have the unique ability to help prevent such a catastrophic event from happening. If we keep our eyes and ears open and never hesitate to report when something or someone just doesn't seem right. With a delicate balance of mental health reform, education, active shooter training, and common sense gun laws, we may one day realize the dream that there will be no more active shootings. We pray that love will prevail over hate. In the meantime, we urge our listeners to stay aware of your surroundings and keep in touch with your loved ones. If you see something, say something. You never know how many lives you'll be saving. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Active Shooter, the podcast. Remember, if you see something, say something. There's no telling how many lives you may be saving. A big thank you to Darren Curtis, who composed some of the songs on our show. You can find him online at www.darrencurtismusic.com. Make sure to check us out on social media. You can find us on Facebook at Active Shooter, the podcast, and on Twitter at Podcast Active. Thank you, and be safe.